1922-23, the nearest hunt to New York City was called the Fairfield-Westchester. It was great riding country, but some had their eye to the north. John McKenty Bowman, of hotel fame, the Biltmore Hotel in New York and hotels in Florida, was a member of that hunt. In 1924, Bowman decided to break away from the Fairfield County hounds, so he purchased property in Golden's Bridge and registered a tract of land between Golden's Bridge and Brewster as Mr. Bowman's hounds. A few years later, the name changed to the Golden's Bridge Hounds. Bowman hired his friend Roy Jackson as fieldmaster. Jackson had bought property on Baxter Road from the Lobdell family and built Rock Ridge Farm and Rock Ridge Stables. In fact, it was Historical Society trustee Debbie Moore's grandfather who built the house and the stables. Later, the property was known as the Lawrence Stables, and today we know the barns as Stony Creek. Roy Jackson was married to Elmira Rockefeller, daughter of William Rockefeller, and he was instrumental in bringing Ben Funk up here as their huntsman. In 2011, the Friends of the Penn Merridell wrote a story on this remarkable huntsman, and the following quote appeared from Alexander Mackay Smith's book of the American Hounds, 1749-1967. Except for the years 1937-1940, when he was with Howard County, Maryland, Ben Funk, who came to Golden's Bridge at age 33 in 1924, continued to hunt hounds through the 1956-57 season, retiring at the age of 66. For more than 30 years, he showed remarkable sport in this cramped, heavily wooded, and deer-ridden country, being one of the first huntsmen in North America to develop a deer-proof pack. He was undoubtedly the most literate professional huntsman of this century, his accounts of runs with Golden's Bridge, written for the Chronicle, being outstanding in their field. Ben Funk was also unusual in his interest in pedigrees. Later in this film, we will see several slides of Ben in the fields with his hounds. It'll be remarkable to see how many of those scenes will be easily recognizable as if they were taken yesterday. In this 1935 map by Dolph Stewart, Bowman's property is seen along the north side of what is now Route 138, just to the west of Richard Bondy's property, another hunt member, and to the east of where Fred Warfield will build his Outlaw Lodge. Stay tuned for more later on Outlaw Lodge. The hunt territory extended west a little into Somers, north through all of North Salem, and further through Brewster to the edge of Pauling, and east into Ridgefield and Danbury. One of the reasons the hunt did so well was because they had full respect and appreciation for the landowners. They entertained and thanked them every year at the opening meets. Some accounts state that some 400 landowners would attend the parties. From the January 13, 1933 Brewster Standard. The Golden's Bridge Hunt gave a supper dance at Bloomerside Peach Lake last Saturday evening, entertaining the property owners and their friends. About 500 were present to enjoy the occasion. One incident that will be remembered with amusement is the failure of the electric lighting system when a tree falling on the wires cut off the current. Then candles were brought forth, and the dance went merrily on. The article goes on to list some 130 or so celebrities, writers, and landowners, all in attendance. These parties were held year after year through the 1960s. In 1930, Langhorne Gibson, who served as master from 1929 to 1934, kept a diary of the hunt. One entry from his 1930 diary says 650 were in attendance at a landowner's dinner, and another says 800 landowners came down to a party and they served all kinds of food, chicken, and a little beer. Even in the days of Prohibition, people still served a little beer. Some of the earliest dinners took place in Golden's Bridge at the old kennels on Route 138. According to Dan McKean, former master of the hunt, who gave a history of the hunt at an Historical Society event in 1984, he said about the party in Golden's Bridge, "There was a peach orchard up and back, and the fox ran right up through there. The hounds didn't catch him, of course," and quoting Langhorne's diary, "and then everyone came back and finished up the beer." Newspaper accounts in the Brewster Standard list some even more remarkable numbers. One from 1936 says 900 were in attendance at Bloomerside. Who knew their hall could hold so many? The total population of the town of North Salem was only 1,100. Even considering the extent of the hunt's territory, that's about half the population. Some other celebrity members of the Hunt Club included Joe Dixon, pictured here for a 1928 Acme News picture press photo. Society of folks attend hunt meet of the Golden's Bridge Hunt Club, Golden's Bridge, New York. Photo shows Mr. Joseph B. Dixon as he prepared to join the hunt. Carlo Paterno is a name fondly associated with the hunt and the town of North Salem. He and his wife Helen came in 1935 with the intent of buying land and starting a farm in North Salem. From a letter he wrote to Dan McKean in 1984, "We drove up to North Salem to look for a place to buy, which would be within 50 miles of New York City and where we could go fox hunting. The place which intrigued us the most was the Jackson Stables, that's Rock Ridge. We drove up and looked all around and thought this was just the right place for us to live, only to learn that they had just been purchased by Lawrence Parish. I can vividly recall the red barns and kennels as if it was yesterday. My father convinced me to rent rather than to buy to see if I liked the commuting to New York and living in the country. So he rented a lovely house on Dingle Ridge Road before buying 316 acres in North Salem. We broke ground on our daughter Carla's birthday, August 19th, 1935. These pictures taken in the 1950s show the black Angus resting in the fields along Baxter Road and the huge barns that once stood across from where the kennels are today. We are told that those on close look in the field, you might still see evidence of the old foundations. According to Dan McKean, those who are fox hunters here really owe a great debt to Carlo, as it was he who put together the property where the racetrack is now. He bought it from the Lobdell family, and across the road he bought the Howe property where he built his home and barns, and called them Meadow Lane Farm. In years following, the land on the south side of Baxter Road would become the first parcels owned by the Open Land Foundation, a gift of the Baxter Road Group. The Paterno home site on the north side of Baxter we knew for many years as Loranda Farm. Dan McKean called Joe Wilshire, the first joint master with Bauman, and his wife Helen. She recounted at the 50th anniversary of GBH how they would come up to hunt in Golden's Bridge from Greenwich. They would use a coach and four, and then they would use two of the horses for the hounds. The country was really wide open, and because the Golden's Bridge Hounds was an offshoot of the Fairfield Westchester, and they hadn't yet recognized by the Master of Foxhounds Association, it was called an outlaw pack. So that's why Fred Warfield, an early member, when he established his stable on Todd Road just off Route 121, before you reach Cross River, he called that stable the Outlaw Lodge. Fred Warfield was an active member of the hunt right up until the 1950s. Here are two photos of the hunt from 1935. If it weren't for the cars, we would be able to tell those photos are from the 1930s. How little the area has changed in 90 years of hunt history. North Salem was always considered the best hunt country. The more popular meets were here in North Salem. The opening meet, even as early as 1934, was held in Salem Center. Lange Gibson said that it was one of their favorite meets, and that, of course, is right at the old town hall, the old Delancey House. In those days, there was not too much activity, no cars parked around, and there was plenty of room to maneuver. Several meets described in the various accounts start from there, some of them over the Purdy's land to the south. They would then swing back across the head of the Titicaca Reservoir and through the cemetery up June Road, and then on up. Other places for meets were Grant's Corners and Battery Farm, where Mr. Raymond lived in the 1930s. That was later the Colley's home, then the Closes, and now is David Peterson's. Duncan Bulkley, who was a member of the hunt in its early days, bought the Vale property on Dingle Ridge Road, and he called his place Dongle Ridge Farm. It is now the Finch Farm. For many years, it was also called Shannon Farm, as the widow Bulkley married Mr. Shannon. The hunt was often along Hardscrabble Road, both on the north and south sides. Hans Rothschild was one of the early buyers of property there, and he called his place Red Shield Farm, which is the translation of Rothschild. Later, it was known as Rolling Stones Farm, and now is Teresa Havel's property. It is mentioned several times in Lange's 1930 diary. In this account, we can follow the hunt as it moves up through North Salem, west from the farms along Hardscrabble, and north to Brewster. We met at Van Pavilion, and in spite of the hunter trials being held this morning, we had a far larger crowd out than I had expected. We jumped in over that famous wall over which there is a familiar iron pipe rider, went up the steep hill and drew that nice bit of country in back of the vineyard, manipulating the new chicken coops with great success, and so on toward Vale Gall's swamp. At first, this seemed to hold nothing much in store for us, so we worked through it and around it, ultimately arriving in line formation on that ridge road a few feet to the westward of the green shingled house with its squeaky old windmill. No sooner was Ben contemplating lifting hounds and drawing in another direction than their intermittent speaking rose to a chorus, and away they went in full blast, bound for the Hudson River. We wheeled about, galloped back through the swamp over those two lovely pastures which we love so well, crossed the cement road, turned sharp left down the hillside, Jack Handy now in the lead, turned sharp right, taking those two high-paneled jumps in the Meldrum Woods up over the latter's beautiful rolling country and onward through Salem Acres. There I waited for the field, worse luck. From then on, the three went on through Mr. Winter's wooded hill, came out into Haight Orchard, bore to the right, proceeded through Mr. Paternow's, more orchards and more orchards, over fine open-going and countless stone walls. The next and only stop was a point on Route 22, where they denned the fox in a culvert, and this almost in the very heart of Brewster. Time elapsed 1 hour and 20 minutes. It is hard to believe, I know, but Tommy Lowinger and myself were flanking them the whole time, and we saw their hoof marks, so I know whereof I speak. Hounds and riders fairly flew, and again a new chapter was written in the history of Golden's Bridge hounds. It is a shame that so many missed out on this epic-making race, chase, hunt, or whatever you want to call it. Things like it happen so seldom in the affairs of mankind that there is no proper name whereby to describe it. As I viewed our country today from this glorious hilltops just south of Brewster, I became convinced, for good and all, that I wouldn't trade it for any other that I know of. From Dan McKean's recounting, there is frequent mention of Van's Pavilion, and I don't know whether anyone remembers exactly where Van's Pavilion is, but right opposite where the hearse bought Mrs. Laura Howe Nelson's house, where the old entrance was with that white gate. The Habermans lived there. There's a stone wall, and right below that stone wall there's a little small building. I've always heard that it's always closed, and the theory is that it was bootlegging hangout. It must have been pretty gay at one time. They must have served beer before Prohibition. When we had meets there and we were standing in front of the building on the edge of the road, you'd say, "Blow the horn, it's time to move on." Then Ben Funk would just disappear around that building, and then the next person would disappear. Where did they go? You'd go around the corner and you'd see this big wall with a pipe on top, and you'd have to jump that. It was always a joke for the new members. In 1940, during wartime, Parrish moved the kennels from Golden's Bridge to Rock Ridge, to the old kennels that were built by Roy Jackson. It was a difficult time. Marion Taylor Clark gave up the hunt, and Lawrence Parrish took it on as master of foxhounds. Because the war was on, by the next year there was really no reason to continue fox hunting except to provide some sport for those visiting men from England who were in the English Army and had come to New York. Ben Funk was still the huntsman except for the 2 years of 1937-1940, the last 2 or 3 that Marion Clark was master. Lawrence Parrish brought Ben Funk back, and he was really an extraordinary huntsman. In Dan's words, some said he was all man and half hound because he seemed to know exactly where the fox was going, and he could keep the packs moving. No sooner would they den one fox and they'd move on and he'd find another fox. He seemed to know if the pack split. He had an uncanny system of bringing the hounds and putting them all on one fox, which was always a difficult maneuver. Around 1940, Fran Duncan, whose husband, Herb Duncan, was secretary of the hunt for many years, drew this map of the hunt. Some of the farms and locations listed on the map are still part of today's hunting territory. In 1949, Carlo Paterno became the single master. He wanted the kennels separate from his stables and felt the GBH should establish their own kennels just for the club. In 1951, Carlo Paterno and Dan McKean became joint masters, and the first thing they did was to build the kennels where they are now. They and 2 others put up the money, and on 5 acres donated by Carlo on the north side of Baxter Road in the middle of hunt country, the kennels were established and are still there today. Carlo moved away in the mid-50s, and Phil Bondi and Dan McKean carried on. Phil Bondi built the house that is now called Windswept, Lois and Jean Colley's property on Titicus Road, overlooking the reservoir. In 1961, Harry Gibson, Langhorne Gibson's son, who, by the way, is the son of the illustrator Charles Dana Gibson of Gibson Girls fame, became joint master with Dan McKean, and they continued through 1967. When Dan dropped out, Harry Gibson and Reg Fox became the joint masters in 67-69. Through this time, they were most fortunate to have Ben Funk, Cecil Broad, and Dick Lundy as huntsmen. You will see many pictures of Dan and Dick in the 1950s slideshow at the end of this talk. It was Ben Funk who took Dick Lundy under his wing, and within a year or two of when he started riding, he turned out to be a marvelous whip. And then for 10 years after Ben's death, he served as the huntsman. In between, Cecil Broad served as 2 years as huntsman after Ben Funk. Besides the huntsman and the whips, the hunt was most fortunate in having a wonderful pack of Penn Dairy Merrydale hounds. Learning and knowing how to breed them and to control them and to take care of them is key to the success of the hunt. In a moment, you will see two slideshows. One is of the 1950s. It is one of the reasons this project was put together. We took the time to scan all 213, but we will show you about 50 here. These slides were taken by Dr. Karsten Johnson, a dentist from Pleasantville, who liked to attend as many Saturday hunts as possible. When he died, his son gave the collection to the Historical Society. The second set of slides is from the masters of the GBH. We were able to obtain several photos, but not all. We will continue to work on this and add the missing photos as they become available to us. We'll leave with two quotes. First is a New York Times article, The Evening Hours, September 4th, 1987. Sunday is the annual benefit luncheon for the GBH, a fox hunting club in northern Westchester. As usual, the setting is a 100-acre horse farm, and as usual, the hounds are putting on the dog for the affair, said to approach Saratoga in showiness. In the words of its chairwoman, Austine Hurst, a joint master of the hounds, this is a country luncheon for 250 sporting people under a tent with flowers and white gloves, and all the ladies dressed to the teeth in diamonds and pearls. Before lunch, everyone will study bloodlines at a breeding show of horses suitable to become hunters. After lunch, the chairwoman plans to dragoon the daughters of sporting families to work the tables and sell off the centerpieces. That way, we get more money for the GBH, Mrs. Hurst said, with a little laugh. It's a cheap trick, but there it is. The second is from Langhorne's diary. So many of us are thrilled that Langhorne's prediction has not come true, and it probably never will, thanks to the dedicated people, landowners, and organizations that work so hard to keep development in check, and North Salem this very special place of open fields, hilltops, woods, and countryside. I fear that I will never make history, but at least I am the first to write down this particular kind, and so a scribe is of some use after all. When the day comes, as indeed it must, after we have all gone to the happy hunting grounds, this diary will be proof to our descendants that things like this could happen in what will probably then be the heart of a great metropolis, and we may then be happy that we have gone to another hunting country. How I hate to think of swan boats on Titicaca's Lake, and of Van Gall's Swamp as the theater district, or the sound of Gabriel's horn in comparison to that of Ben's. Lest I become more morbid over such thoughts in the decision given today against Golden's Bridge Hunt Team at the Hunter Trials, I shall lay down my pen.